I'm Paul Willis from the English department, as many of you know, and I have the honor of introducing one of my favorite short story and novel writers, Gina Ochsner. Gina is from Salem, Oregon, where she grew up and still lives in a small town of Jefferson, near Salem. And so you'd think that her fiction would be very provincial, but her stories are set all over the Russian and Eastern European and Baltic worlds, really. And she's a curious traveler, a good listener, has wormed her way into many unsuspecting family overseas. And her fiction is the fruit of these good listening ears and eyes, these observant eyes that she has. Just a little about Gina. She is a graduate of George Fox University and studied creative writing at Iowa State, also at University of Oregon. She was sharing with some of us in the fiction writing workshop today that she was a late bloomer, didn't feel she had a lot to show for herself in college or graduate school, but knew she had a passion for writing that she wanted to keep developing. She landed a short story in the New Yorker on her 15th try, she shared with the faculty. So she's a very persistent person and has become an excellent writer. She has published 2 short story collections and 2 novels. All 4 of these books are available outside the door as you leave, should you like to purchase one and have her sign one. She has another collection of short stories ready to go for an eager publisher. And are you reading from that newer collection?
Yes.
Yeah, and I believe this new collection is all the stories are set in Oregon, actually. So you've become provincial in your later years. Gina teaches at Corban University in Salem, which is a Christian college there. She's also a very important part of the Seattle Pacific Master of Fine Arts and Creative Writing faculty, where she mentors the students in that graduate program in fiction. We're also honored to have a friend of ours and a friend of Gina's, Paula Houston, who has also taught in the Seattle Pacific MFA program in the nonfiction area. So if you're interested, those of your students and going on to get an MFA, Gina and Paula are great people to talk to about that. So Gina will read for maybe 35, 40 minutes, and then there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. We'll be out of here by 8, okay? So if you have things to do, you don't need to get restless. Just sit back and enjoy. Well, the title of one of your books is The Russian Dream Book of Color and Flight. Yeah, enjoy the flight. Okay. Gina Ochsner.
So I decided I wanted to read something a little bit creepy. Just it has a slight creep factor to it. I try to rein it in. I don't want to give anybody nightmares. I read a story to a group of high schoolers at a camp, and the next morning 3 girls came up to me and they said, "That was too scary. We did not sleep. Don't do that again." I thought, yes, I scared some high schoolers. Yay. Okay, so this is called Soon the Light. In the old Clatsop story, God pinched the mud of the North Oregon shore into mountains, carved rock to jagged crags. That's how he cut his hands, and his blood stained the flats of the North Plains. Every autumn, as if remembering this event, the soil north and east of Astoria pushes forth blood-bright cranberries. That's the way Yaska heard it from Indian Ginny. Because God suffered, those who work the North Plains harvest suffer. This part Yaska could vouch for. 30 years of hauling fishing nets had pulled his chest toward his hips and put a thick hump between his shoulders. 30 years of work had turned his bones to chalk. That's the reward of hard work, Mother says in her many letters, but he knows fear has stove him up as much as the work. Not hospitable waters, these. 40 gill netters were lost this year alone, and it was only May. 40 reasons to content himself with his single net tied to a piling and his weir set along the quivering flats. Set netters don't drown like the gill netters do, his spinster sister Kari had said on his 55th birthday. They kept house together. She cooked and cleaned, did laundry, gave advice. And so from that day on, he fished the flats where the sandbars glistened at low tide, and he could look north and west and watch the gill netters fishing the mouth where the river water met the ocean. He could look and thank God he wasn't out there with them. It's women's work what you're doing, his friend Lasse teased. Lasse had lost a leg somewhere in France during that war, and now anything other than war or gill netting was women's work. I'm not so young, Yaska said. Yes, but you're a Finn. How can you live with yourself? I don't. I live with my sister, Yaska replied. Kari. Mother writes to him every other week asking about her. Yaska, is she eating regular like? Is she working? Any unattached men showing interest? Yes, yes, and no. He has never written to Mother about that trouble in the woods some 30 years ago. Typical trouble single girls working in a kitchen camp might get into, but they were Finns and Lutherans. Kari should have known better. She should not have been surprised when she got pregnant or when her man, Bucky or something like that, didn't rush to the altar. About the man's untimely death, cut from the crotch to crown by a haulback, he never wrote. Nor did he remind Mother that Kari was 50, well past the notice of men, that she'd been measuring sugar and salt and flour at Gunderson's for nearly 20-some years. Instead, he wrote to Mother about the 40 men lost, the desperate search by Peacock Spit, the treacherous sandbars that shift without warning. He wrote about a man who had tied himself to the boards of his boat. He washed ashore on a single beam. His tongue hung from his mouth. His eyes had been pecked out. Mother possessed the unflappable Finn nature. Little shocked her. She lived through the lean years, she liked to remind him, the hard years in Finland that drove so many of them to Minnesota and North Dakota, where she assured them the living was easier, the winter lighter, the cold warmer. It was this Yaska thought of as he thread through the dark toward his single net and weir, the easy living in Astoria, 27 canneries, 52 saloons, 12 churches, 2 of them Finnish Lutheran, a movie theater, a union hall, 4 saunas. This abundance would kill a woman like Mother. All those houses painted in bold blue, rose, or yellow, set like thumbtacks pinning the fir-covered hillsides. An excess of cheer, Mother would say. Yaska picked his way through the bull kelp. Beyond the eastern hills, a long silver wrinkle widened and throbbed with light. That would be dawn. Beside the piling, his lone net lay flaccid. But the weir, the hoops of which jutted from the sand like ribs, rocked, wriggled, thrashed. Too strong for an eel or salmon, these movements, and the noise coming from the weir, too human to be anything but a child. Yaska hurried for the weir, flung open the lid. Inside, mired up to the waist in mud, was a boy. In an hour, the tide would have taken him. Stop flailing, Yaska said. He dug at the mud around the boy's waist and thighs, scooping with his trowel, cursing under his breath. A minute, 2, and then he freed first one leg and then the other to the shin. Grab tight, Yaska said. The boy wrapped his arms around Yaska's neck, his one leg around Yaska's waist. With a grunt, Yaska pulled. A loud slurp, and the mud released its hold. Yaska tumbled, heels over head, and the child laughed. Yaska's first thought, how shall I write about this to Mother? Yaska figured the child to be 7, maybe 8 years old. Not from these parts, he was sure of it. How do they call you? He asked in Swedish, English, Spanish, Finnish. A chunk of horehound candy lured the boy into a metal wash tub, but you would have thought Yaska was pouring acid over him the way he jumped and squirmed beneath the pitchers of warm water poured over his back and arms. "Settle down," Yaska murmured, pouring with one hand, holding the boy in the tub with the other. Layers of bladder wrack and seaweed clung to his back, torso, limbs. More warm water, more candy, and a good long sit before the greens peeled away and the boy beneath the mud slowly emerged. Yaska rested on his heels, blinked at the creature before him. Hard to believe this was the same child pulled up from the marl. So beautiful now to behold, a cherub like something from a fine painting that belonged on a vaulted ceiling of a cathedral somewhere. If God existed, he existed in this boy. That's how beautiful the child seemed to Yaska. And yet he could not discount the otherworldly quality of his alabaster white skin, hair white as dry clouds, eyes an odd cornflower blue. Well, did not Jonah step out of the open mouth of the whale, his skin blanched blister white? Did he not stumble upon that shore dumbfounded and disoriented? The boy, Yaska decided, must have suffered a similar fate. We do, after all, still live in the age of miracles. Yaska pulled the boy out of the tub, rubbed a towel gently over his shoulders and back, his skinny legs, his feet. Only his feet were imperfect. One foot twisted inward at the ankle, the other foot had no arch. Kari squinted at the boy from her perch by the hearth. He could read the look in her eyes. He brought the child in. This was a mess she wouldn't clean up. Kari approached the boy, so white the child, like he'd been drawn up from a big vat of bluing, and the eyes, dull and oddly non-reflective, like they would swallow her up in darkness. Kari bent and ran a finger along the boy's bony shin and touched the twisted foot. "Someone put him in your nets. He's not right, and they wanted to get rid of him." Yaska gave the boy more candy. "Does not every creature bear the image of God?" "Surely they do." Kari glanced at the hard light in the boy's eyes. Not dark now. Light as if a twilight sky full of stars, icy cold and distant, passed through them. "We cannot fathom the largesse of our creative God," Yaska continued. "Did not St. Paul say we are made perfect through our imperfections?" Well, that's a question she spent 30 years tiptoeing around. Better to turn her hand to what can be touched, gathered, cleaned. Kari gathered the wet towels. "If you're going to keep him, you ought to fit him for shoes, like those special ones they make in Portland," she said. "He's fine the way he is." Yaska scooped up the boy, flung him over his shoulder. The boy shrieked with delight as Yaska plodded up the stairs, laughed and ran his hands over Yaska's hump. In Mother's most recent letter, she made requests. "Tell me the untellable story. Tell me a story that outstrips time." She wanted a love story. She wanted joy. Those are stories Kari can't tell. About love she never wrote. About Bucky she never wrote. She wrote about the woods, the way they swallowed her up. The darkness brewed within them. That was her meat, her milk, her music. "Darkness," she wrote, "makes a clean heart in me." About her own child who lived for only a day she never wrote. Only Indian Ginny and Leela, the pastor's wife, knew about the infant she put into the water down by the docks. Leela said, "God understands all," but the look on her face said, "That's what you get for chipping around with men in the woods." And sure, she was forgiven on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday, nobody wanted a thing to do with her. Those were the bad years, 30 of them to be exact, consisting of calendar days, tide schedules, letters from Mother. Mother writes, "Bolsheviks, they creep through the wheat fields at night, singing Soviet hymns, good songs, lousy lyrics. Those godless Bolsheviks, they ruin all that is right and beautiful. Are there Bolsheviks in Astoria?" There are, in fact, a few. The Red Fins, Kari tells her, meet in the Socialist Hall on Front Street. They even have their own newspaper. Some of them are leaving for Karelia, a Soviet promised land in what was once a part of Finland. They are helped along by cannery bosses who are only too happy to pay their passage if it gets the talk of unionization out of their mouths. Mother describes the ballet in Minneapolis. The way girls mince about, tippy-toe. baffles her. Why don't they just hire taller girls so that they can walk normal like? Mother asks. Hey, Ginny yelled from the porch. You seen my man? I've looked all over for him. Her eyes roved aimlessly. Kari put the kettle on the stove. He's gone, Ginny. Yeah, but I've got supper ready for him. If you see him, tell him I'm looking for him. Kari motioned to the chair in front of the stove. Come in, Ginny. Ginny dropped a large burlap sack on the porch, scraped her boots on the step, and crossed the threshold. They had to get this conversation out of the way before Ginny would come in and drink the raspberry tea Kari always kept at the scald for her. Indian Ginny, Bucky's Ginny. Kari wanted to hate her. Bucky had left Kari for Ginny. But Ginny was so simple these days, childlike and forgetful, and it seems wrong to hate a child. Grief had scrambled Ginny's brains, but somehow she remembered to stand on Kari's porch at least twice a week and ask after Bucky. Kari set a mug on the table. Torger was found dead this morning. Someone set fire to his shed with him in it. Ginny reached for the mug, a loud slurp. And you know about old Hans? Kari nodded. Taken off by a cougar. Ginny set the mug on the table and leaned toward the staircase. White! The child had crept down the stairs and fixed his gaze on Ginny, and Ginny shuddered. The devil is white, white. White and reeking, the smell of marl, the rank and rot of things that wash up onto the rack line filled the room, and this after a full bath. He's lost, I think, Kari said. Yaska says he's a prophet, like Jonah. Ginny surveyed the chalk-white hair, the misshapen feet. My mother knew a prophet once. At night he closed his eyes. His body lay on his mat, but his spirit was in the stars. He died twice, then came back to the living with messages from bears. Heaven is full of bears. Ginny stood and nodded toward her sack on the porch. Daffodil bulbs. We could plant them along the cow trail. We could wait for Bucky. It's not the right time for planting bulbs, not on the trails, not with all the rain, so much of it that the hooves of the cows have turned up like snowshoes. Their bovine instinct for safety has kept them off the hillsides. Not so for Jenny. The hills could slide right out from under her, the mountains crumble. Nothing will keep the woman from her rituals. Let's go, Kari said to the boy, pulling on his arms. He wriggled away. Kari tried again. He sank to the floor, a heap of dead weight. Kari dragged the boy to the door. He could walk, she knew it. This was a game and she was having none of it. Walk, she commanded, and the boy flailed and carried on with a god-awful racket that put the crows to flight. Ginny scrutinized the boy. Then she hoisted him into her arms as if he were no heavier than a sack of potatoes, carried him up the trail on her short, sturdy legs, leaving the bag of bulbs for Kari. Kari followed, her gaze on Ginny's stubby legs. Ginny had the strength for hauling nets. Also, she had her own mesh boards and could tie good knots. Maybe this is what Bucky saw in her, a woman who would be at home on a boat, who would work and never stop to ask why. At the trail's summit, they had a regal view of the bay to the south, and to the west and north the shipping channel and the river's wide gray mouth. Behind them was Sugarloaf Mountain and a scabland of bare rock and scrubby pines. Kari hunkered over her knees and pushed bulbs into the soft mud. Daffodils, a ridiculous prospect. Nothing grows well here. The wind and salt and stabbing rain stunted everything, bent all life on the hills to horizontal lines. Everything but the razor grass nattering and whistling, slicing the wind to jagged slivers. The boy hummed. The wildness up here seemed to calm him, but then he spied a Swedish tanker gliding along the lane. He scowled and threw rocks off the cliff. Ginny crouched in front of the boy, her eyes sparking bright. What will you do with him anyway? As if awaiting her reply, the boy turned his gaze, primal and untainted, on Kari. The pureness of it blinded. Kari turned her head and looked at the bay. I'd put him in the water, Ginny said. It's kinder to them that way. Then, as if touched by electricity, she straightened. Did you hear that? Bucky, he's calling me. Kari peered down the trail. Sure, she said as Ginny lumbered down the path. It's a kind of love, these lies. What harm is there in weaving loose fictions? Bucky's at sea, Bucky's in the woods, Bucky is the wind. Buggy should have been a wolf, Kari tells the boy. Well, he should have been given a wolf's name. That's what you do if you want someone to live a long life. What kind of name, after all, is Bucky? Kari reached for the boy, who allowed her to pull him up on her back. She had not named the baby. It could not have lived with or without a wolf's name. Sure, she'd said the prayers you were supposed to say for newborns, but what words for an infant turning blue, then racked with a jagged breath, 1, 2, punching the air with tiny fists, then silence, gone. She does not remember the weight of that other child in her arms, the sweet smell of his hair, the color of his eyes. She was tired of tending messy memories. Besides, this boy on her back was here now and needing her. And Jaska was right. He was beautiful, except for the feet, beautiful and perfect. What will we call you? She whispered, knowing he would say nothing. The boy dug his heels into her stomach, wrapped his arms tighter around her neck. The heat of his body against hers loosened something below her stomach, a liquid pressure from between her legs. Kari raced down the trail, past the hedgerow, the Scotch broom, Jaska's old nets. As the boy slid off her back, Kari bolted for the biffy. That pungent odor of ammonia carbide, she knew it was the smell of her monthlies, even before she pulled up her dress and sat on the wooden ring. What to make of that thick, dark stain on her underwear, she wondered, she, a woman who'd not had monthlies in over 5 years. Jaska didn't know socialism from rheumatism. The meetings in the socialist hall, what they talked about, he didn't know or much care. Not a hall fin, not a church fin. He kept to himself. His hump saw to that. It started as a knot of muscles that wouldn't unclamp. Round like a steel trawl float and anchored between the shoulder blades, it ached when the weather changed, when it rained, when the fogs rolled in thick. 30 years in the making, his hump, this reminder of a body bent by gravity. His hump provoked sympathy from the elderly Finnish women, so sorry for him. Kindly jokes from the men, unguarded looks of fascination from children, but not from the boy. He licked his index finger and traced the bulging outline as if to say, there, or now. Jaska stood before the mirror and lifted his shirt. There, now. The hump was there. He turned sideways. Now it wasn't. A trick of his changing sight? Jaska arched his back and reached with his fingers. There, but just. He pulled his shoulders back. Always when he did this, hot searing pain stung from vertebrae to vertebrae. Now it didn't. Jaska dropped his shirt and began the longest letter he'd ever written to Mother. He wrote how at low tide sunrise pooled in the litter of clamshells glowing wet and pink. The boughs of the Douglas firs were sighs whittling the sky into pieces. Dawn painted the hemlock's rough bark umber, and dusk turned it maroon. He wrote of the freckled globes of the violet foxglove and how they held an interior light of their own. And yet for all this natural beauty, nothing, he wrote to Mother, compared with that of their new lodger, a boy, such a beautiful child and so light. When he carried him on his shoulders, he seemed to weigh less than Gunderson's sacks of meal or salt. And when he carried the boy on his shoulders, his back didn't ache a bit. His step was strong and sure. He had the strength of his youth. The boy had given him this, he wrote. Mother wrote, "Are you reading your Bible regular like? Are you training up the child right?" Jaska reads the Gospels in their mother tongue. On this, he and Kari agree. Jesus sounds so much smarter in Finnish. Kari reads to the boy from the New Testament, accounts of miracles and healings. Sight to the blind, strength returned to the halt and the lame. This earns a sly smile from the boy and nothing more. His stubbornness, she believed, is to be evidence of some Finnish in him, though his hygienic habits spoke otherwise. He won't use the outdoor biffy. He won't use a fork or spoon. Though his fingernails are long as claws, he will not allow anyone to trim them. Suffer little children, Kari reminds herself. It is the correct, loving, and Christian posture. Of Jaska's love for the boy, there is no limit. This is the enchantment of children. They reveal a capaciousness we didn't know we had. With the utmost care, he mixed flour and glue to make a mold of the boy's feet. For hours, he boiled leather to render it soft and supple. With infinite patience, he sewed strips of leather to fashion shoes with a long, firm tongue running from the heel to the calf. That the boy shows no interest in these proceedings bothered him not a bit. It is a kind of love to do for someone what they don't know or care needs doing, washing him, speaking gently, showing him the mesh and how to work the wooden tongue in the mesh board. He loved to surprise the boy with gifts. He bought him floats from Soviet Russia and Japan and sweets of all sorts from Gunderson's. The double-salted black licorice, ribbon candy, sticks of striped horehound. Who you buying this all for? You got a girlfriend? Gunderson liked to joke, and Yaska, not a smiler by nature, could not help laughing. Yes, laughing. So more weirdness happens inside the house, and then strange things happen to Indian Jenny. She makes a declaration to Kari that this kid is just wrong. Yeah, you really need to get rid of it. And then she dies mysteriously. So there's a lot of odd goings-ons. And then something else. They awoke the next morning to bad news. All the milk at the dairy had gone on the blink, curdled even as the cows stood in their stanchions. The Chinese at the cannery were on strike. Pastor Yuha's horse had been hawked. But it was the news about the 12 men lost at sea that put everyone on edge. From the Bible, Yaska read to the boy about storms and seas and Jesus who calms such things. Kari looked at the boy. In his eyes, she discerned a preternatural coolness, a distance that suggested, indeed, they were of two separate worlds that were only just now intersecting. A smile twitched at the corner of his mouth. "Mother," he said. One word. What cruel power the word wields, how it tugged on a thread from a deep, dark center of herself, where she is wilderness, empty and wild. "Mother," he repeated. Kari lunged, her hands circling his neck. Yaska leapt from his chair and shoved her hard. Kari fell to the floor and stayed there, pretended to be more hurt than she really was. But it was the boy Yaska looked after, making him tea and speaking to him in soothing tones as he hoisted him on his back and headed out into the widening night. That's the way it is between some brothers and sisters, washed with different waters. That's how different they were. She was surprised it took this boy to show her that. Every night darkness knocks on my windows. It wants to build a house inside of me, one splintered stick at a time. Like the tongue of a lock inside a door, gently, gently, darkness turns and lengthens, closes. I am quite shut in now. P.S. There is something wrong with the child, and I do not mean his feet. What are you going to do? Kari set the letter aside. Yaska sat by the fire with the boy. So much trouble, this boy, and now Jenny, dead, and it made no sense. Nor did the riot at the cannery or the murder on the docks. Kari looked at Yaska. "We are changing," she said. The boy found a stash of Mother's letters, had them spread out, had folded them into shapes. His hands danced through the letters. Which ones, his hands seemed to say, shall feed the fire? Yaska sat watching the flames rise and fall, rise and fall. A letter sailed into the grate, then the leather shoes and straps. Yaska inhaled sharply, and the boy laughed. "Do something. Do something," Kari said, once to herself, the second time to Yaska. Yaska nodded slowly, though she could see that his eyes were wet with tears. They agreed to take the boy to Seaside. They'd go early the next morning. They'd say they found him abandoned. They would say he was touched, one of God's simples in need of aid. Perhaps an orphanage in Portland would take him. Surely a child this beautiful would be adopted. Kari rose first. Night still slicked the undersides of the ferns, gloved each frond and blade. The cavilling of the owls wobbled low and ominous. She listened to Yaska and the boy breathing quietly beside each other. In the weak light, his skin seemed to glow translucent. Jenny was right. Better to put such creatures back where they came from. Mother, she would like to write, did Christ our Savior forgive us of every sin? And did he, Mother, forgive us of wrongdoing we knew we would commit and were not in the least bit sorry for? Kari bent over him, her shadow clothing his body. She put her mouth near his, took in the sweet breath. His dark eyes snapped open. Mother, he said. Kari fell back on her heels and scrambled down the stairs and out the door. When Yaska woke, the fire had burned to embers. He sat studying the liquid glow of the coals. Through the kitchen window, he could see the moon like a plum float, bobbing luminous on the dark water of the bay. In an hour, the water would swallow it. Dawn would break in a gray wash. Take me, pull me out or under, I'm ready. He'd tell the boy they were on a journey. They'd make a special visit for horehound candy in Seaside. Be it right or wrong, a crime or an act of kindness, he would not let himself think. Boy, he called. The child liked to sleep, sometimes in the bathtub, sometimes under the bed. Boy? Yaska hoisted himself from the chair, up the stairs, down again, to the porch and the yard. Boy! What new trouble he would or had already caused, this too he did not want to think about. Kari's voice rang in his ears. Do something. Kari groped through the waist-high sword fern, plodded along darkness over the trail toward the cliffs. Nattering rattle, wickering wind, isn't this the dark music, her meat and milk? She'd put it on her tongue, swallow it down. That's what she'll write, Mother. The brittle fog gloving the trees, she'll write about that. And dawn, how it draws darkness to itself. Neither a blessing nor a curse, it simply happens. Their only job is to navigate it. Near the top of the trail, Kari tripped over a root, caught herself on a brittle manzanita bush, allowed herself to lie on a bed of moss and watch the sky warm from pigeon gray to eggshell blue. All around her, green shoots of the bulbs she'd planted knifed through the mossy sward. Kari rolled to her elbows, stood and peered over the edge of the cliff. The fog thinned to scraps of cloud, and in the distillation of light through it, radiant. A drawstring pulled on her abdomen. Wasn't that Yaska down on the flats? He'd not brought his thin planks to walk on or a pole for balance, just Yaska ankle deep in the marl. And the boy, his wild white hair danced in the wind. He hopped about in the mud farther away from shore, farther from Yaska. Oh, you fool, she wanted to shout. Who is the child here? Take him to Seaside or give him back to the water, for this land surely cannot abide him. Instead, she cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted Yaska's name. Tiny sandflies, sharp as grit, hurled themselves at his face. A litter of mussel shells split open, glowing lavender, glistening wet like eyes. All that separates us from where we want to be is a bit of water, bits of glass. Mother wrote this in her last letter. We must walk on water, she wrote, walk into that light. And so light, this silver glass, this water, so strong, surely he will walk on it. Before him, in the shallow surf, the child stood, rising through the platinum silver, a fulmination of his every dream, so perfect and so perfectly needing him. Yaska's feet moved of their own accord, carrying him closer to the child. The flats shone like a mirror. The child stood gazing at him, brilliant light everywhere. Yaska shielded his eyes from the glare. Only then did he notice the child cast no shadow. Oh, what, Mother, oh, what would you say about this? And the child beckoned with a hand, urged him into the water, and then a voice, sharp and shrill from the heights, Yaska, don't! A dark crease, a crumple to the light, that voice. At the sound of it, he shook his head as if it was, like these flies, mere irritants. Yaska took another step toward the boy. The water lapped at the boy's knees, then his thighs, his waist. The water lapped at Yaska's ankles, shins, and knees. The trick, Mother wrote, to walking on water has to do with faith. I'm blind, quite blind now, and I can tell you this with certainty. You close your eyes and you keep walking. Dizzy with light and blinded by the glare off the wet sand, Yaska walked with the hesitant, toddling steps of a small child. How far would faith take him? A game, a trick. The child, now past the safety buoy, was playing with him, beckoning him, pretending to be caught up in a net, and then jumping free, splashing. He'd not figured the boy would be so quick and agile in water. But just as he was about to grasp something solid, an arm, a leg, the boy swam beyond Yaska's reach. Not a good game, not with the tide coming in. Yaska waded further. The water heaved, and the boy plummeted, then reappeared, not smiling now, but thrashing and flailing. It seemed now he really was tangled in the net. Father, he cried, his voice thin and spectral, save me. Hang on, Yaska called, even as another swell lifted and dragged the boy under. Yaska! Kari's voice again, this time much closer. Yaska turned. She was setting planks, a rope over her shoulder. Help him, Yaska called. She had the strength of 3 women now. The boy had given her that. She could get the rope to him, he knew. Throw, he hollered, pointing to where the boy's head crested briefly and then vanished. Kari looked at the child, gasping, choking, and then at her brother, mired thigh-deep in the mud. Oh, mother, 1 rope and 2 in peril. Is it a sin to let go the one you know you shouldn't have? Kari set another plank. One end of the rope she tied around her waist, and the other she looped as a lasso. She had lost Bucky because he had wanted to be lost. She had lost her child because he was never hers to have. The boy in the water, he wasn't hers either. But Yaska, to his hips now in the mud, he was a different matter. For what she was about to do, he would not forgive her. That would be her burden to bear. But it's a kind of love to do what must be done because no one else can or will. And it's a kind of love to let go. Kari swung the lasso once, twice. On 3, she let it sail where it landed true. Impervious to his noise, his threats, his anguish, Kari cinched the rope tight, and hand over hand, she started the long haul.
Yes. What are your literary influences?
Oh, gosh. I have a lot, and they change. I really like how Angela Carter took really old fairy tales that a lot of us know, the scary stories about what happens to you if you go out in the woods by yourself, Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, all these things, and would retell them in more contemporary settings, and often making the protagonist the female. And seeing how she could let out the seams of these stories and make some new garment out of them. They're really a lot of fun. So I like how she does that. I like Joy Williams. She writes a story called The Changeling, and after I wrote this, I read her book The Changeling, and it is in fact about a child who's kind of been swapped and isn't really the woman, the main character, and she spends her whole time trying to figure out who and what is this creature. It's a glorious book and so well written. So I like what Joy Williams does, and I like all the magic realists really. Yeah. So there's just so many. I'm reading a lot of German literature right now, and Czech literature, and I'm really loving it.
I'm just curious, is the setting of that story, is there a certain year?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking, I kind of had, without saying it, I was kind of thinking late 40s, somewhere around there. They stopped using gill netters, I think in the 50s in Astoria, and they switched to motorized craft. But there are some wonderful pictures. There's a beautiful historical museum in Astoria that shows all the different kinds of fishing vessels that were used. And that particular place was really treacherous. Over 2,000 ships had gone down, 2,000 different kinds of vessels had gone down where the Columbia River meets the mouth of the Pacific Ocean. And so that river tide meeting the ocean tides just created quite a cauldron. But that was the best fishing area as well. So people would go out into it knowing, between May and September, knowing there'd probably be 100 people each year that would lose their lives there, if not more. So I think of it as being a really rich ground for stories, and particularly scary stories, and there are a lot of ghost stories told about this area. So, and to me, that's really fascinating, the overlay of myth, superstition, history, folktale. And then Astoria is just a really interesting place because a huge Finnish population came in the 30s. And so then there was this big clash between the Swedes who were already there and then these Finns that were considered dirty, and they spoke a language that the Swedes didn't understand. And then there were a lot of Chinese who had done just a lot of the heavy lifting in building up some of these coastal towns, but were almost always unacknowledged. So there's these different population, different people groups right there. So not only is there a lot of turmoil in the water, but there's this turmoil, in this little community. And Astoria was really a rough little town. There was at one point one murder per week. And nobody really worked very hard to try to solve any of these. So I just thought this is a perfect place to have bad stuff happen, because historically it was already happening. So why not make a bad thing worse? That's what fiction writers do.
So you mentioned Clatsop or Fort Clatsop at the beginning.
Yeah.
Which, right, is where Lewis and Clark
Yes.
overwintered
Yes.
on the Pacific coast near Australia.
Yeah.
Do you layer any of your stories that far back, or?
I would like to.
Uh-huh.
I think it would be really fun to spend more time working backward through the history. There's really a huge French presence in the Pacific Northwest that, again, gets largely unacknowledged.
You said French?
French, the ones who came on the river and did all the heavy work.
Oh, right, for the Hudson Bay.
Yeah, for the Hudson Bay Company, but then there were trappers, and they would marry, many of them would marry, lower Colombian Indian women, not Salish, but all the different tribes, Chimecada, Kalapuya, all of these different groups. So there was really a large, I think, more French than anything else for a time. And I don't know that much has been written about that. I think you can find it if you really want to go hunting for it in the different historical societies, if you go county by county. But I don't know that it's like comprehensively been like all gathered together. And I remember going to school, and we start with Lewis and Clark.
Yeah.
We start in like 1805 as if that's when history in the Pacific Northwest started. It's like, but we never questioned it because we didn't know that the French had already been there for a long time, and the English had actually already been there for a little while, and the Spanish and the Russians, and there's actually like a lot of people who had been through there, and of course the Native Americans, like since forever. So, and I just never knew, in the fourth grade when we were introduced to Lewis and Clark, we were like, oh, history's starting now in 1804. Oh, isn't that great? And so I just find that fascinating. And the more you dig, the more you can find, and the more there is to see. So I think it would really be fun to spend more time digging and working backward.
Would you ever be interested in possibly writing a retelling of a fairy tale story? Because you said you were interested in reading German.
Yes. I'm at work on one now. I'm retelling Hansel and Gretel, but it's really Gretel's story. Because in the original, Hansel's the smart one. He has all the great ideas, and she's sort of like, oh, okay. But it's Hansel that the witch wants to eat. And it seems to me that's really a story about hunger and consumption and like the mismanagement of love. Because the parents are so hungry, they don't think they can all make it, so they put kids out there. Like what? So the wolves can eat them? The kids are hungry, so they go and they eat the witch's house, which she wanted them to do. She's hungry and she wants to eat the boy. I thought, this is really all about satisfying some very basic impulses for survival, and I want to look at those and how they get conflated and confused.
I was just listening to an interview with Ken Burns, who's just finished his latest 8-year project, which is on country music.
Okay.
Yeah, he just picks these different topics. And so they were asking him, they said, it seems like music is such a huge part of everything you've ever done, and the famous track from the whole Civil War project. And he said something so fascinating. He said, I start with music. Before we do anything. I mean, we'll do research and all this stuff, but before the story is even put together, I choose all the music and we produce it in the studio, and that everything is linked through the music. So I was wondering if there is something that you can think of in your own writing. Your writing is so kind of unique and unusual. Is there something that you use to link these different kinds of impressions you have, images that are in your head? I've seen your gigantic board.
Oh, I was just
on
going
the
to say,
wall.
well,
Yeah.
I have this gigantic whiteboard,
Uh-huh.
and I'm looking for rhyming images.
Oh.
If that makes any sense at all.
No, tell us what they are.
Well, I don't know. That's about as far as I've worked it out. So like a rhyming image would be mother going blind, and then Yaska out there being blinded by that light, the mirror-like quality of the light on the mud. The fact that they have brought this child in and she has lost a child, there's a little bit of a rhyming action there. So I try to think about how can I find parallels and either rhyming action or twinned images, so that each will kind of hold a conversation with each other.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm asking so much.
No.
I was quite interested in your writing process because you use a lot of imagery in your work, and I was really interested in how you come up with those images.
Oh, yeah, well, some of them are happy accidents. I try to think about who that person is and what's important to them and how would they see the world through their eyes. And not just like the world in general, but like honestly the soil, that plant, the light through the window, how it appears to them, and then find imagery and words and clothe it in a voice that is more like them, less like me. I think that's the tricky part for me, because sometimes author me wants to get my hands all over it. That's probably the most fun part and the most intuitive part, the hardest part to talk about. It's like if you ask a painter, can you tell me what you were thinking about when you chose that color? They can talk about it abstractly, but once they actually pick up their paintbrush and they try to show you how to they stop talking because the other part of their brain just took over. Now they're busy like creating, and so sometimes it's hard to talk about the thing that got created, exactly how you did it at the moment. But it is something I do kind of think about, like where do these images come from? Where do you go to find images? Because they don't really sell them at the image store. You have to kind of think your way through.
What is your ethnic background, and does that influence your writing, and do you talk about it with your family?
Oh, that's a great question, because I'm adopted. My mother's Swedish, and I'm adopted into a family that's not, and I really don't look like them at all. And it's something people comment on everywhere we go. It's like, now it's the family joke. It's like, which one doesn't fit? So I'm like really big and they're really small. So, and it might be why I'm so interested in writing about other people, why I like to go to other places and kind of ask them a lot of questions about who they are and what's important in their family. So I've been really interested in Russia and Latvia and more recently Serbia and Bulgaria, and maybe it's because I'm just sort of not so much searching for another family, but I'm curious about how families work and what's important to them and how they talk to each other about who they are, because it's not a conversation that often happens in our family. We have a whole bunch of things we don't talk about. That's one of them. So yeah, I think that's what fuels a lot of writers. They find the things that are not necessarily off limits, but the awkward things that aren't discussed, and they go, that's what I'm fearlessly going to write toward and go into. Those things that I'm afraid of or I find confusing or distressing or disturbing, I'm going to write about that.
Thank you again,
Yeah,
Gina.
you're welcome.